You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode number 95. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. Hello, my friend. Welcome back to the podcast. It's Paula here. I'm so happy and excited to have you here with me this week. Happy belated International Women's Day. The day that I'm recording this podcast episode, March 8, 2023, it is International Women's Day. And wherever you are, whether you are a woman, whether you identify as a woman or not, I just wanted to acknowledge and celebrate this day. I think it is so worthy of celebrating. And for all of us who do identify as women, big hug, big pat on the back. You're doing a great job. Now, last week, when I sat down at this very same time to record the podcast episode that I recorded about career options for lawyers, if you listen to it, then you'll know it was snowy in Vancouver. I had a cold. It was kind of one of those wintry days. And by contrast, today it is gorgeous. It is sunny. I'm feeling way better and very inspired to share with you all about career transitions for lawyers. I mentioned last week that I get asked often what career options are out there for lawyers. And another question that I'm asked about often is transitions. You can imagine during the pandemic that this was a topic that came up a lot. I was invited to speak at a number of different organizations to talk about change and transitions. That was a theme we were all dealing with all at once. And it continues to come up in my practice. And today we're going to do a deep dive into transitions, specifically career transitions for lawyers. And so I'm excited to have you on board. I invite you to think about how this applies to you. I'm going to be talking about transitions in different levels to give you a heads up about what we're going to be talking about today. The meat of today's podcast episode is I'm going to define transitions. So those will be external and also internal transitions. I'm going to talk about what typically holds people back and what moves them forward when they're making a transition. And then finally, I want to share with you a change cycle model that will help you to identify where you're at in a particular transition and help you know what to expect when you go through a transition of any kind, and particularly when you go through a career transition. So with that, I want to first start out by defining why this is a challenge, why making a career transition is challenging or difficult. And I think first and foremost, change is hard, right? I think for some of us, change can be really exciting. There are times where I'm just chomping at the bit. I'm ready to jump into something new. And chances are the same is true for you as well. If you're going on a vacation, for example, and you're looking forward to a change of scenery, there's all that extra dopamine of being surrounded by new faces and new people and new customs, new cultures. But at the same time, certain changes are really, really hard. They're scary. They're terrifying because you don't know what is on the other side. And we're going to get into that more deeply. But this is one of the reasons that I see people holding themselves back from making a transition is that there's the fear of the unknown. We all experienced that when the pandemic struck. There was that fear of what was going to happen when we just didn't have the information. We just didn't know how things were going to unfold. Another reason why transitions can be difficult is that sometimes we resist them. So if we're looking at those transitions that we're kind of dreading, where we have a lot of fear around them, we don't know what to expect, then we start to resist them. And that resistance creates even greater anxiety, fear, and really slows down any momentum, forward movement that we might have in relation to that transition because we're literally stepping on the brakes. We just don't want to go there. And another thing that can be really challenging with a transition is that you're comfortable, right? You may not be super comfortable. You may be quite unhappy, but there's a certain predictability and there's a certain level of knowing what is expected and what your days are going to look like. And if you choose to transition, that might mean tearing out an entire system that you've been relying on. If it's your job, it might mean uprooting an entire professional work day, week system that you are now accustomed to. The people, the compensation, the nature of the work, all of that is going to change, and that can feel really disruptive. And so when you think of the discomfort of doing something different relative to the discomfort of staying where you are, you might choose simply to stay where you are. Now, there's nothing wrong with this. There's no moral judgment attached to any of this. If you find yourself in this position where you're reluctant to make a transition, then you're certainly not alone. One of the reasons that I'm keen to talk about transitions today is that I think we can get really good at making transitions, and we can learn to be more welcoming and accepting and more excited about transitions. I'm hoping that's something that you will take from this episode today. Other reasons why it's really difficult to make a transition, well, it's that risk factor, right? And if you're a lawyer, sometimes people say that lawyers can be, in general, risk averse. This may or may not apply to you. I think in my own world, I am a lawyer. I no longer practice. And I think sometimes, yes, I am quite risk averse when it comes to certain things. I'm a lot more risk tolerant or risk inviting at this stage of my career than I was when I first started out. That's for sure. And so you might think about what your risk tolerance is and how that might inform your approach to transitions. It can also be overwhelming, right? If you look at what your options are, if you start thinking about transitions, you start doing that research, looking at job boards, and it just feels like you don't even know where to begin, then that can stop you. And you might also feel like, ooh, I don't really want to make a transition right now because I'm involved in this big trial. And if I leave, it means that all the lawyers, my team that I'm going to work with, they're all going to be let down. And so I really should stay put at least until the end of the trial so that I can make sure that I've helped them carry the ball to fruition. It may also be that you don't know if where you are is the best it's going to be, right? I think what holds a lot of lawyers back is not necessarily being happy in their position, but looking at other positions and saying, well, is it actually going to be any better if I move from where I am to that other opportunity? And so what can happen is that sometimes you have this instinct, this voice that keeps calling to you, that keeps on nudging you and telling you, hey, have you thought about making a transition? I don't know that this is really the spot for you for the long run, or maybe it is the spot for you, but the thing that you're doing within that spot isn't quite the right thing. And so you keep getting these nudges, but you ignore them because the idea of having to act on it is just too overwhelming. It's just too difficult. You might start looking, you might start meeting with people, you might start looking at job boards, you might start learning more about other opportunities and then decide, as I mentioned before, that it's just too overwhelming, it's too much work, you don't want to do it. Or you might be in the position where you do start looking and you do find what you want, in which case you get to dive into a fresh new transition. And if that's what you're experiencing, or if that's what you're about to experience, today's podcast episode still applies to you because when I talk about the change cycle, I think sometimes you can jump into a transition and you're excited about it. You're wanting it, right? It's absolutely what you want. And then it's hard. And then you start to question yourself. So when we talk about the change cycle, I'm going to go through 4 different stages, and that will help you orient yourself because sometimes you make that change thinking it's going to be great. And when it's difficult, you think you've made a mistake. You may not have made a mistake. In fact, I don't really believe in mistakes. I think we can call things mistakes, call them failure, but they're always learning. As long as you're moving forward, you are learning, you are growing. And so this episode, what we talk about later, might actually help you out in respective transitions, even where that transition itself didn't feel all that challenging to you. Now, what can happen, of course, is if you don't make a transition, then you might find that you stay put, you stay stagnant, you start to feel really stuck where you are. You might start feeling trapped. You might suffer from the so-called golden handcuffs or whatever that might be described as for you. And it's not necessarily where you want to be, right? And so the purpose of today is to help you if you are feeling stuck, if you're thinking about making a transition. You might even be in the middle of a transition right now without even being aware of it. I'll get to this in more detail when we talk about the change cycle, but there may be elements of your practice that are changing, that are in transition. They may not be those obvious changes like going from one job to another. But when you start to see yourself in the process of a transition cycle, it might help you understand yourself better and feel more confident about you in relationship to your practice. So I'm really excited to dive in, really excited to talk to you about transitions. This is something that comes up a lot in my practice. And so I'm delighted to have you here. So I mentioned earlier that there are really 3 tools or ideas that I'm going to share with you today. The first being looking at how we want to define transitions. The second being some of the characteristics that I've noticed among lawyers that I've worked with where they succeed in making a transition and where they do not succeed in making a transition. And then finally, I'm going to share with you the change cycle. And then you can think about where you're at in that cycle and how that will help you navigate your next transition. So starting with the definition of transition, the online Oxford Languages Dictionary defines a transition as the process or a period of changing from one state or condition to another. And change is defined as making something or someone different, to alter or modify. And different in turn is not the same as another or each other, unlike in nature or form or quality, and also distinct or separate. Now, I also have the word for, or the definition for transform, which is to make a thorough or dramatic change in the form, appearance, or character of. So what you'll notice runs through the theme of all of these definitions, this idea of transition, is that you are changing. You are taking substance A. Here it's your career, form A, and you're transitioning it into form B. And what that means is that it's going to be different. And I know this sounds really basic, but what that translates to for you is that there are going to be elements that you are going to need to let go of. There are parts of your career that you're going to need to say goodbye and perhaps mourn the loss of. And when you move into B, when you make that transition from A to B, you're going to be taking on new. And so there's this adaptation period of the new, which can be exciting and it can also be challenging. So when you think about a transition, as we've described it here, and then we want to look at it in relationship to your career, there are changes that are external changes. And these are ones that are relatively easy to measure because you're basically going from box A to box B. It's an externally measurable outcome. So what are some examples of that? Well, you might be in a job right now and you leave that particular job and you go into another job. So that could be within your organization. You might go from student to associate, associate to partner. You might go from partner non-equity, for example, to equity partner. You might go into management. You might become a practice group leader. There's all these different transitions that you can make within a single organization. Each of those is a transition. It's a transition that is externally measurable. You may move into another organization. So you might move from firm A to firm B. You might move from firm to government. You might move from government to firm, in-house to firm, vice versa. You might go to a nonprofit. What you're doing here is you're changing your job. This is, I think, what most people think about when they think about a career transition is, are you moving from one job into another? It may also be that you are changing in the nature of your work. So for example, if you are a lawyer who works within an organization, whether it's a firm or government or in-house, and you decide to create your own practice, you are changing your identity from one of being employed within an organization to being a self-employed or the principal of or the founder or the entrepreneur. So you're changing, you're moving from an organization to your own independent practice. That is an external measurable change. Now, there are other ways that you can change that are externally measurable. For example, you might grow your practice. And so you might take on a new practice area. You might take on a new client. You might develop a team. You might also change your practice area. You might decide that you want to take on a role in community leadership. So in addition to your professional work, or perhaps as part of your work, you might start joining boards or getting involved in other organizations as a way to enrich and supplement your legal work. You may also experience the transition of adjusting to your work after becoming a new parent. This is a transition I'm very familiar with, going from being a lawyer who has as their primary responsibility their own health and well-being, and perhaps other responsibilities with their family or other outside sources, but nothing quite to the same extent in the example that I'm thinking of here as having children. Once you make that transition, my experience was now all of a sudden I'm on call 24/7. And so my ability to show up and devote however number of hours I want to any particular project is now circumscribed by my responsibilities as a parent. And if you have a family, if you have young kids, then you know what I'm talking about. You can probably relate, where you need to make sure that somebody is looking after the kids. And so it's either you, it's a school, it's a nanny, it's a daycare, it's your partner, but it's all of a sudden your transition is that you're now thinking about multiple things. Like you can't just think about your work necessarily. So those are some external transitions that you might experience in your career. So changing jobs, changing roles within an organization, starting your own firm, growing a team, taking on new opportunities, and starting a family. These are all some transitions. You may be able to think of other transitions. I'm sure there's other transitions out there. These are the examples that I've come up with for today. Now, in addition to what is externally measurable are the transitions that are internally measurable. So what do I mean by that? Well, in that definition, we talked about letting go of an old identity and forming a new one. And that is largely an internal shift. So when you move, for example, from an employee to a leader, whether it's within a firm, if you're taking an ownership interest and you now feel more associated as an owner versus an employee, that might mean that you identify yourself differently. You have different responsibilities within the firm. You're going to need to learn how to delegate, how to take greater responsibility, how to increase your comfort levels in that new role. You might find that you shift from a rule follower to a trailblazer. So I see this shift sometimes in lawyers that I work with, where you may feel like you followed almost like that good girl checklist of getting good grades, getting good job, having a good family, taking care of your health, like you're following that checklist. And then you reach a point where you decide that you want to go out and color outside the lines. You want to create something that is quite different. And so there's an internal shift that goes along with that, where you may previously be someone who goes with the flow, and now you're no longer going with the flow. You might have been sort of caught up in the momentum of going within a certain direction. Now you're branching off in a new direction. Instead of following precedents, you're innovating. Instead of avoiding risks, you're now taking risks. And so that's going to require that you develop a sense of self-trust. It's going to require that you develop your courage in order to step out of conformity if that is what you're used to. You might also find there's a shift from deferential to assuming authority. So again, you may find that as you transition into a new role, that you're required to make an internal shift where you are taking ownership over your professional work, over your files, over leadership of a team. It means building up your self-confidence. You may have relied on others, for example, to give you certain validation, to approve of a certain course of action, of kind of validating you as a professional. And now you may need to rely more on yourself in order to do those things. And so you may also see, I've got a few ideas here, so I'll just share a couple more, but going from a perfectionist, for example, to a pragmatist. So you might find that very early on in your career, you're really by the book. You're really looking at things from a very black and white perspective, a very perfectionist way of thinking. And what you might find is as you develop, as you learn more and become more savvy, and you start to see the nuances and how there's the law and how there's a law as applied in the real world and what is a practical solution and all of that, you might find that you are required to shift your way of thinking to be one that is increasingly practical. And this may apply in your legal work. It may be in relationship to how you perform your legal work. So if you're building your own firm, for example, it's figuring out how to do that business development, for example. How do you want to approach that? Maybe a perfectionist approach is not going to serve you in that respect. You may need to be a little bit more comfortable with trial and error. So these are some transitions. If you're shifting from a perfectionist to a pragmatist, that might not be externally measurable to somebody else, but you will absolutely experience that shift. Another example, from people pleaser to selectively accessible. If you start implementing boundaries in order to advance, let's say you are promoted and you have a new role, and previously you were very accessible, and in your new role, you need to start carving out some boundaries to make time and space for new responsibilities that come along with that role, you're going to have to let go of some of the people pleasing. You're going to have to get a little bit of comfort around disappointing people sometimes. Another transition from doer to delegator. If you're used to doing everything yourself and now all of a sudden you're going to relinquish control and ask others to do that for you, that can be a really difficult shift. So what I'm getting at here is, in the realm of transition, you may often, or you may by default, associate a career transition with that concept of moving from A to B. And what I'm inviting you to think about is that the shifts that will happen, the transitions that will happen, will be external and they'll be internal. And we want to give space to all of that, because those internal shifts are what are going to enable you to excel and to thrive in those external transitions. So what stops people from making transitions? So we've talked about how we've defined transitions in a career sense for lawyers. And now we're looking at what stops people. And I've mentioned a few of these already, but let's do a deep dive. And I came up with this list based on what I've observed in other lawyers, whether these are lawyers who I've worked with professionally, as back when I worked as a lawyer, or who I continue to know socially or professionally as a lawyer, and also lawyers who I've had the privilege of working with in my capacity as a coach. So some of the obstacles that have prevented lawyers from making transitions, number one, is probably fear of change. I think this is probably the most common reason why lawyers do not make transitions, particularly the A to B transitions, moving from one job to another job, for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. I mean, it can be overwhelming. You may not know what to expect. I talked last week about different career options for lawyers and how navigating that transition can be really difficult. There's a number of factors that you're considering: compensation, nature of the work, your team, the unknown, risk tolerance, all of that. So fear can really have an impact in terms of keeping you in place. And we just talked about those internal and external transitions. That would be an area where you can make a lot of headway by working on those internal shifts. If you can wrap your mind around the fear and get to understand that fear better, that might turn a bottleneck into a flow through, because now you're able to understand your fear and not let that be something that stops you from moving forward. Another obstacle is not knowing what you want, or knowing what you want, but not being willing to rock the boat to get it. And so you might relate to that. I've certainly seen that, where you might know what you want, but you don't want to have that conversation because it would be awkward potentially. Somebody might say no. Then you have to live with the idea that maybe you asked your employer for a different arrangement, or to move into a different role, or to take on a different practice area. And so you do run the risk that they might say no, and then you may not want to live with that. You might, this one's very common, you might allow the momentum of good enough to keep you on the same track. And there's, again, this comfort with the devil you know versus the devil that you don't know. And so you may be moderately unhappy, but you're comfortable, you're compensated, you know what to expect, you have a certain level of enjoyment in your work. It may not be perfect, but that can also keep you in place. You might find that putting your needs behind the needs of other people can hold you back. That's an obstacle that I see. So sometimes those are the realities. People are depending on you to do a certain thing within your family. And so you may feel like you cannot make a move, that this is just not a time that is possible for you. You may be satisfying someone else's dream. That does come up sometimes where, your parents really wanted you to be a lawyer, or, you take great pride in it because your friends are all lawyers. You may have colleagues that depend on you. You may have clients that depend on you. You may have your professional network, and you may think, I just don't want to disappoint anybody by making a big transition. You may really want the stability of where you are. You want the predictability. You want the safety. So these are all reasons why you might simply look at transition and say, you know what, it's just not for me. Finally, another obstacle that I see, again, this is a big, big obstacle for lawyers, is time. Not having the time to make a transition. And what that translates to is not making the time. And I get it. I get it that you're super, super busy. And if truly you want to make a transition, there will be a requirement for you to somehow find the time, somehow carve out the time. And I know that can be really difficult, especially if your practice is crazy busy. If you have a family, for example, if you have outside commitments, it may be really challenging. And it is one of the reasons why I see lawyers getting stuck and stalling and not making moves, even when they want to, is because they simply cannot find the time. Now, by contrast, there are characteristics that I have seen move people forward. So we'll go through those. Probably the biggest forward momentum factor is making a decision. So deciding that I'm going to leave my job and find a new one is probably one of the indicators that you are going to make a transition. Now, sometimes it is you that has made that decision, and sometimes it will be the organization that you work for that makes a decision for you. And that decision, once made, frees up so much rumination and questioning and wheel spinning, because you're no longer weighing the pros and cons of staying or going. Do I stay? Do I go? There's all this over here. There's all that over there. Once you've made a decision, there's a line in the sand, and now you're fully into the action mode. You're fully into making that transition happen. And so that is probably the biggest motivator or impetus builder, is to simply decide that you are going to move. What else moves people forward? I think when the discomfort becomes unbearable, that can also move people forward. I think sometimes you can be in a position and it's not great, but then it's almost like the heat gets dialed up and it continues to get dialed up until finally you're like, no, you know what? Like, I thought I could make this work, but it's really not happening. I know I need to make a change. And so when that discomfort level reaches a certain point, then that can be the impetus for change. I think a willingness to roll the dice. So when you decide that you're going to be okay no matter what, and you're willing to take a chance, that's when people move forward. I think self-belief. So when you develop that confidence in yourself, some people have it innately. They just know that they're going to be fine wherever they are. They feel confident. They have the courage. They're ready to take that leap of faith. And for others, you may need to build up to that. And then finally, I think just committing to a change, having that slow and steady decision or approach to transitions. And this probably applies more to the internal transitions. I mean, you could do a slow and steady transition into a new role, for example, that external change. But I think really for those who are committed to almost transforming the way that you approach your work from the inside out, that I think is more of a consistent, ongoing transition. It's a series of transitions where you increasingly align yourself with how you want to practice relative to where you are right now. So we've gone through the first couple of ideas that I wanted to share with you. Number one being, what is a change? Number two being, what are some of the factors that people who change do or do not do that help them or hold them back from making changes? And then finally, what I would love to share with you today is something called the change cycle. Now, this is a cycle that was created by Martha Beck. Martha Beck is a very well-known life coach. She has a book called Finding Your North Star. That's where I first read about this particular change cycle model. And I think it's so interesting and so applicable to help navigate the different stages of a transition. And so in this case, there are 4 stages to her transition. Number 1 is death or rebirth. That's square one, is what she calls it. Number 2 is dreaming and scheming. Number 3 is the hero's saga. And number 4 is the promised land. So you can imagine this is a cycle. So it keeps on going. It's like a clock. If you look at a clock, the hands of the clock keep on going around the clock. This change cycle is always in motion, regardless of where you are right now. So as you listen, I'd invite you to think about where you would situate yourself within the cycle in different areas of your life, in your career, and also maybe there's other areas right now that you're thinking about where you're in transition. You might think about where you would situate yourself. Now, the first thing that I think is important to know about Martha Beck's change cycle is that square one, death and rebirth, is initiated by what she describes as a catalytic event. And a catalytic event is like a shock. And I think we probably all know what a catalyst is, right? When you think of a science experiment, it's that element that goes into a transformation. It's kind of what initiates a change, a chemical change. But the catalyst itself remains intact at the end of it. Anyway, so here, what is the catalyst for change? And sometimes it's a shock, right? It's something that you might consider a negative shock, like a job loss or an adverse health diagnosis, for example. It might also be a positive shock, right? When you have children, that is often a shock. And it's a wonderful shock, but it absolutely uproots every other aspect of your life. Sometimes the catalytic event is an opportunity. So it might be a promotion. It might be a lucky break. It might be you're offered a dream job, for example. It's still a transition. It may be that your transitions are internally driven, right? That you are making a decision to change. So if you're looking at a job transition, for example, the decision to change might come from within. You may decide that it's time for you to move forward. And that kind of a catalytic event, that kind of a decision, that kind of transition might be more difficult in the sense that you're the one who's coming up with a decision. And so it can be harder to justify. If you compared that, for example, to being let go from a position where that decision is made or your firm is restructuring or the job simply doesn't exist anymore. I mean, these are all externally driven. So when you're looking at a transition that is driven from within, it can sometimes be harder to initiate that change because you feel the weight of responsibility and you might have a little bit more rumination in relation to whether or not you want to move forward with a particular decision. So that is the initiating event, this catalytic event. And what that does is it moves you into square one, which is death and rebirth. And so this square involves death. And you can imagine how difficult that is. So when you go from job A to job B, you're letting go of a community. You're letting go of compensation potentially. You're letting go of clients. You're letting go of opportunities. You're letting go. You're saying goodbye. And there's a certain grief and loss and mourning that comes with that, even if what you're moving to is something that you think is going to be better for you in the long run, in the short run even. It can still be really difficult to say goodbye to those things. And so the significance here when you're in square one of the death and rebirth is allowing yourself to grieve the loss, the death of certain aspects of your practice, and also certain parts of you going into those internal transitions. If what you're doing, for example, is you're going from that person who does everything to being the person who's delegating to others, you might be giving up parts of your work that you really love. There might be certain methodical types of work that you actually enjoy doing that you're not going to be doing anymore. So there is a loss there. There is a loss, for example, of being able to rely on somebody else to take responsibility. And if you're going to be the one who's now responsible, you're going to have to say goodbye to that. So every transition is going to have, in a sense, a death of certain elements of whatever it is that is A. If you're moving from A to B, you're going to leave certain elements of A and you're going to move into B. So what happens is when you move into B, there's this rebirth. There's a transition when you move into that new role, when you take on additional responsibility, when you decide that you're no longer going to be someone who has no boundaries, you're going to adopt those boundaries. There is a rebirth. And this is where you are reconstructing, or you're creating for the first time a whole new career, for example. It might be a new job where everything is new. You report to a different office, different colleagues, different files, different clients. It may be that you're stepping into a new professional identity as a leader, as an owner versus an employee. So that is also kind of exciting, right? What is new for you? And so what happens in this square? There's this really interesting stage, which Martha Beck describes as a liminal period. And liminal is Latin for threshold. So when you look at that space between the death and the rebirth, this is the liminal period. And it's a time when you're on the threshold between identities. You're neither here, you're neither there, you're not inside, you're not out, you're not one thing, you're not the other. That particular time can be really confusing and really unsettling. If you're in that period right now, then you know exactly what that feels. It's almost like you're untethered. You don't really know where you're going. And an analogy you might think about is, let's say you're on the shore of a beach and you're trying to swim from one shore to another shore. And as you look out from the shore that you're on, you actually cannot see the other shore. You have to jump in the water and start swimming in order to get to the position where you can actually see the other side. And if you jump in the water and you start swimming, you might reach that point where you can still see the shore that you came from, but you can't yet see the shore on the other side. And that can really be disorienting, and you might feel like you want to go back to that first shore. In the middle, I think that's where you get into your liminal period, right? All of a sudden, you're neither here nor there. Maybe you can't see either side, and you're going to have to keep going in order to reach the other shore. And that is where you're going to have to really lean into your own internal compass. Martha Beck talks about that North Star. You might think about your internal GPS. You're going to have to get really grounded and really look within in order to get yourself across to the other shore. And what's important to remember here is not to misinterpret the fact that you're uncomfortable as a sign that you should stop. You know, if you're in the middle of that body of water, you probably don't want to stop. You want to keep swimming, and ideally you want to keep swimming in the direction of moving forward. And when you're in this stage, you might think about how you want to approach this death and rebirth. And one of the recommendations that Martha Beck makes is to make small moves and gather as much information as possible. So if you're thinking about this in terms of a career transition, this is where you're out there talking to people and gathering as much information as you can about options. What might work for you? If you're making an internal transition, what is it that you're trying to transition to? So that is square one, death and rebirth, and that can be a very challenging square to be in. From there, you move into square two, which is dreaming and scheming. Now, this is where you start birthing ideas that you never could have conceived of before the catalytic event. So if you imagine you've gone from one shore to the other, and now all of a sudden you have a completely different perspective, right? You're looking back on where you came from with a fresh set of eyes, and the ideas that you'll have for moving forward will be brand new. So this is a period of high creativity. This is where you start envisioning the practice, the life that you want to create. And you'll create a blueprint for what it is that you want to create for yourself. You might hatch a plan, you might hatch a business plan, a plan for how you're going to transition from the job you're in to a different job. You're going to create an inner vision, which will gradually translate itself into the real world. So you can look at this square as that exciting, dreaming and scheming. It's a period of vision and creativity. And from that square two, you're going to move into square three, which is called the hero's saga. Now, this square is where the rubber meets the road. So you take all those lovely blueprints that you created in square two, and now you're going to start implementing them. And this is a very pragmatic square. This is a square that is full of trial and error, because what you might find is that all these dreams and visions that you created in square two, when you try to put them into action, they don't actually work the way that you wanted them to. And you might find that really discouraging. But do not be discouraged, because as long as you keep going, as long as you keep pressing toward the vision that you have, you keep pressing toward the goal, the transition that you want to make, you will eventually have a miracle happen, right? It's finally going to click. And when it does finally click, then you move into square four, which is the promised land. This is that place where if you look at that change cycle, starting with the death and rebirth, moving into the dreaming and scheming, moving into the hero saga and then finally getting to the promised land, that is ideally where you want to be spending most of your time. This is where you are tending versus building. So if you think of a garden analogy, for example, you might have been really busy in those earlier squares, tilling the soil, deciding what seeds to plant, waiting for the plants to grow, watering, waiting, all of that, trying different fertilizers, whatever. And now you're finally there and you're tending, right? You're pruning the odd thing here and there instead of that wholesale in the mud trying to get things started. And this is really where you want to be. And so what does that stage look like? Well, you're enjoying the fruits of your labor. You're making small changes. So you're tinkering with what you've got there. So you might find yourself in a role now, a position where you're now feeling comfortable. You're thriving. You're growing. Everything is great. And what is, of course, going to happen once you're in this promised land is that there is going to be another catalytic event. Yes, there's going to be another catalytic event. And so what we now know is that there's a cycle to it. And next time you find yourself with that catalytic event, then you're going to be able to navigate this change cycle with greater ease because you've gone through it before and you have a roadmap of where you're going. And as you've been listening to me describe the change cycle, I wonder, and I bet you have had in your mind examples in your past where you've gone through change cycles. You may not have had a model for it. You may not have called it the promised land. You may not have called it the death and rebirth, but you can probably identify in your past cycles that you've already gone through. And now you have a framework that you can use. And what's so great about having a framework and about going through a change cycle is the meta learning that comes along with it. So if you think about learning a new language, we say that it's helpful to learn a language in addition to your mother tongue, because the process of learning a new language will help you to learn other new languages. And the same is true here. If you learn the process of going through a transition, if you expect that it's going to be difficult at that death and rebirth stage, if you expect that you're going to make these plans and none of them will work, but eventually something is going to work, if you know that that's going to happen, then you don't feel so terrible or doubtful or fearful when you're in the middle of it, because you know that's exactly how it's supposed to unfold. And what you might also find when thinking about these different squares is that some squares might be more comfortable for you than others. You might actually really thrive in that initial chaos of the death and rebirth. That might be where you get really excited because you love change and you don't care about, the certainty, or you're highly risk tolerant or whatever it is. You might find that's a great square for you. You might really like the dreaming and scheming square. That might be your favorite square. You might really love the testing and trying square. You might also love the promised land square. So think about yourself and you might find that there are different squares that resonate more strongly with you. And finally, what I would love to say about this is that having a model like that is now you've got a tool and you can use this every time you go through a new transition, whether it's one of those external transitions that we talked about, one of those big changes from job A to job B, or if what you're doing is making smaller transitions within your own current role, right? And these are some of the changes that we might think about in terms of gaining confidence, gaining leadership, all of those types of skills. Now, the reason why this is an effective tool, why this concept, that the tools, the concepts I'm teaching you today, this idea of looking at what a transition actually looks like, whether it's internal or external, thinking about some of the factors that make for successful transitions or not transitioning at all. And then finally, using the paradigm of a change cycle to situate yourself in any given transition. The reason this is going to help you is that it helps you manage your expectations. It helps you prepare not only for the nuts and bolts of the transition, but what the experience of the transition is going to be like for you. And it will also help you better understand yourself. It might help you have that additional awareness of where you're at in a particular change cycle. It might help you have additional compassion for yourself. Maybe you find you get really frustrated because things aren't moving fast enough. And now you can kind of situate that and say, well, actually, this is all part of the cycle. This is exactly how it's supposed to happen. It's not a reflection of me not doing this properly. This is it. And to do this, to make these types of transitions, you'll need a few skills, which I'm confident you already have. Number one is a willingness to make a transition. Again, going back to that one of the first points I made is that there's so much resistance around transition, whether it's for fear, whether it's overwhelm, whether it's discomfort. And so if you can develop that willingness to experiment and allow yourself to build up your transitioning skills, then that will help you with the transition that you want to make and other transitions that you're making throughout your career. Other skills that you'll need are courage, so that willingness to put yourself out there, try something new, even when it's difficult, even when the results are not guaranteed. And finally, it's a commitment. It's a commitment to yourself. It's a commitment to the process. It's a commitment to the decision that you're going to exchange the comfort that you have now in exchange for the promise or the possibility of what you can have when you decide to move forward. And what will happen as a result is, number one, you'll be able to navigate your transition. You'll be able to step from point A to point B, and you will also get better at the art or the meta skill of transitioning itself. So that, my friend, is what I have for you today in terms of navigating a career transition. I hope that what we talked about today resonated with you and that you're able to walk away from today's podcast episode with some ideas about transitions that you are making, whether it's in your career, whether it's outside of your career, and how you can navigate that change in a way that feels better, where you now know what to expect and where you can have a framework to apply as you navigate future changes. Now, if you are transitioning and you would like support, I am, of course, here and would love to have the opportunity to talk about how I might be able to support you in navigating any changes that you're experiencing, whether they're external, I'm wanting to move from one job to another types of transitions, or if it's more of that internal transition, if you're advancing in leadership, if you want to build your confidence, if you want to learn how to establish better boundaries, if you are a new parent and you're trying to figure out how to navigate this next phase of your career and personal life, please do feel comfortable. Feel free to reach out to me. I would love to help support you. And if you know anyone who is going through a transition, please share this episode with them. And finally, I know I keep bugging you about this, but if you've been listening to the podcast, if you enjoy it, please do leave me a rating and review. It does help others find this podcast. And that ultimately is what I'm hoping to do, is to share these tools, share these resources with lawyers who would really benefit from having this as a resource. So thank you so much for helping me with that. Thank you for joining me this week. Happy belated again International Women's Day. And I very much look forward to reconnecting with you very soon. Take care. Bye for now. If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. For instructions on how to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com/podcast launch. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.